Born in darkness. Darkness. Ethan felt it before his eyes could even open. An undefined, obscure space enveloped him like a thick shroud, shapeless, without direction. And yet he did not fear it. Within this darkness something else existed, warmth. The warmth of his body pressed against something soft. A slow, steady heartbeat echoed in his tiny ears. A familiar scent seeped into his senses, a faint earthy fragrance, bringing an inexplicable sense of security. He did not know who he was. He did not know where he came from. But he knew that here, in this cramped and shadowed space, there was something sacred that he could not yet name. Movement. Something stirred around him, tiny bodies trembling like his own. A soft sound emerged, weak cries barely audible as if calling out by instinct. He too tried to make a sound, but his voice was so fragile that it almost dissolved into the darkness. A gentle nudge pushed against him. A rough tongue swept over his soft fur, leaving behind a feeling both soothing and strong. By instinct, he curled inward, hesitating, but soon his small body relaxed. This warmth, he did not know what it was, but it made him feel safe. He curled up amidst the familiar presence around him. His mother's body, his tiny siblings, and the gentle embrace of the darkness. He did not know what lay beyond this place, nor did he understand who he was or where he would go. But he knew that here in this moment he was alive. The role of the eldest brother. Ethan grew faster than his younger siblings. Even from a young age he felt a difference within himself. Though his memories were hazy, though he couldn't recall anything from his past life, a sense of responsibility was always present, etched into his soul as if fate itself had ordained it. He was not just a cat. He was the eldest brother. The first awakening. The first time he opened his eyes, the world around him appeared in blurred patches of color. The cave where he was born was not large, but it was enough to shelter the four of them. Cracks in the rock allowed faint beams of light to seep in, casting soft glows on the fur-covered ground. His mother, a gray-furred feline with sharp, watchful eyes, lay nearby, thin yet strong like an immortal guardian. He could feel the sternness in her gaze every time he tried to leave the nest. His younger siblings were still weak, their eyes barely open, their legs unsteady. They huddled close to their mother, oblivious to the world beyond, knowing only the warmth she provided. But he could already feel the cold draft sneaking through the crevices in the rock. He knew this world was not only filled with warmth. There was something else, something dangerous. A lurking darkness waiting beyond the cave. The first lessons. His mother taught him how to survive. From his very first steps he had to learn to observe, sense, and react. His mother was never gentle with him like she was with the others. She let him walk on his own, fall on his own, and rise on his own. When he cried, she did not comfort him. When he showed fear, she simply looked at him with a silent gaze, as if saying, "If you cannot stand on your own, you will never be able to protect those weaker than you." He did not understand it at first. But over time, as his claws grew sharper, as he leaped onto rocks his siblings had yet to reach, he began to grasp the meaning of that lesson. He had to be strong. Not for himself but for them. The leader of the den. With each passing day he became more aware of his role within the family. When his mother left the cave to hunt, he was the only one strong enough to watch over his siblings. Whenever a cold wind howled through the den, he was the one to shield his younger siblings with his body. Whenever an unfamiliar sound echoed in the night, he was the first to growl, even if he too was trembling. One time, when their mother returned late, his two youngest siblings whimpered from hunger. He did the only thing he could, he tried to find food. Though he didn't know how to hunt yet, he ventured out of the cave, leaping from rock to rock, searching desperately for anything edible. He failed. He returned with scraped paws and an empty stomach, but he had learned something. He could not just be a cat. He had to be a survivor. The burden of responsibility. His younger siblings grew each day, but they remained carefree and naive. They didn't understand that the world was not as kind as the sunlit afternoons inside the cave. He understood. And because he understood, he worried. Every time a bird flew past the cave, he didn't just look at it with curiosity like his siblings. He wondered, is it a predator? Could it harm us? Every time the wind changed direction, he noticed the unfamiliar sense that his siblings ignored. Every time their mother was gone longer than usual, he could not sleep. He could only lie there, his eyes wide open, listening to every sound outside the cave. The price of being the eldest was not just about being stronger. It was about never being allowed to be weak. The darkness that awaits. Winter was approaching. He didn't know what the future held. But he knew the world outside was not just filled with sunlight. The darkness was waiting, and he would be the first to face it. Strange dreams. During the day he was a stray cat, the eldest brother of a litter, a skilled hunter, a lone warrior in the wild forest. But at night, when darkness fell and the cold seeped through the cracks in the rocks, he was no longer himself. The dreams came to him like fragmented memories of a life he had never lived. Or perhaps, had he? The first pieces of the puzzle. The first time he dreamed of standing on two legs he was terrified. It felt strange. His body was taller, no longer possessing the agility of four limbs but instead an unfamiliar instability, as if he might collapse at any moment. He looked down at his hands. No, they were not the claws of a cat. They were long fingers, rough and calloused with time. Faint scars ran along his palms, the marks of someone who had once wielded a sword, who had fought in battle. He tried to take a step forward, but these legs were too foreign. They did not move with the grace of a cat, not with the silent, predatory steps he knew. Instead they felt heavy, burdened. Then a voice echoed, "Who were you before?" He jolted awake, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his heart pounding harder than usual. Around him was the familiar darkness of the cave, the steady breathing of his younger siblings still sound asleep. He was no longer human. He was a cat again, sleek black fur, golden eyes reflecting the moonlight. But the dream haunted him. He could not shake the feeling that the voice was not merely an illusion. The dreams become clearer. Each night the dreams grew more vivid. One night, he saw himself clad in heavy armor, standing amidst a battlefield littered with corpses. The sky burned red like fire, screams echoed all around. A blood-stained sword lay in his hand. Someone knelt before him, a frail figure, trembling, their eyes filled with terror, begging for mercy. But instead of sparing them, he raised his sword. Blood splattered. He woke up trembling, his whole body shaking. His breath came in ragged gasps as if he had just escaped a predator. But no, this time he was not the hunted. He was the hunter. Another night, he stood atop a towering structure, looking down at a city glowing with thousands of lights. Below, people moved about, unaware that someone was watching them from above. Yet inside he felt nothing. A void. A loneliness he could not name. Then there were nights he knelt in darkness, shackled, blood dripping from his hands. Before him stood a massive door, an enormous gateway leading to 6 paths. A whisper brushed against his ears. "Which path will you take?" He awoke in confusion but also in fear. These dreams were not mere illusions. They were fragments of something real. But whose memories were they? The black cat's shadow. Then one night he dreamed of a cat. Not just any cat. A black cat. It walked through the darkness, its silent steps leaving no trace. Its golden eyes gleamed faintly, like flickering lanterns in the night. It stared at him. A deep, knowing gaze. As if it had seen him before. As if it was him. He could not move. He could not breathe. Everything around him faded, leaving only that black cat and its piercing gaze. Then a voice echoed from nowhere and everywhere. "Have you forgotten?" He snapped awake. His heart pounded so violently he thought it might burst. His breath was ragged, his golden eyes wide as they adjusted to the darkness. There was no one in the cave. Only his siblings, still fast asleep, oblivious to the inexplicable experience their eldest brother had just endured. He tried to calm himself. It was just a dream, wasn't it? But then, as the moonlight streamed through a crack in the cave, illuminating the still surface of a nearby stream, he stepped forward and peered into his reflection. A black cat with golden eyes stared back. In that moment, a strange sensation washed over him. A feeling he could not name. He had seen those eyes before. But where? And who was he really? Surviving in the wild forest. Life in the wilderness was no leisurely stroll. It was an unending battle where only the strong had the right to survive. And he, a lone stray cat, had no choice but to become strong. The first steps of a predator. When his mother disappeared, he understood that he could no longer rely on anyone else. His younger siblings were too small to fend for themselves, and he had no other choice. Hunger tormented him day and night. His mother had once brought them food, but now those tiny, precious meals no longer appeared before him. He had to hunt. But how? For the first time he crept out of the den at dawn, when the forest was still veiled in morning mist. He moved by instinct, each step as silent as a ghost, his ears pricked to catch the slightest sound. And then he saw it. A forest rat, nibbling on a nut near a decaying log. He crouched low, eyes locked onto his prey. A strange sensation coursed through his veins. An ancient thrill of the hunt, the intoxicating excitement of standing at the thin boundary between life and death. 1, 2, 3. He pounced. But the rat was faster. It darted away, vanishing into the underbrush before his claws could even graze it. He had failed. For the first time in his life he felt powerless. But he had no time for self-pity. If he didn't learn to hunt, if he didn't learn to survive, he and his siblings would die. So he tried again. The next day. And the next. Again and again. He failed over and over, but with each failure he learned something new. He learned to move slower, to keep his weight lower, to control his breathing so his prey wouldn't detect him. And then, on a quiet afternoon, he succeeded. His sharp teeth sank into the small, trembling body of the rat, the warm taste of fresh meat filling his mouth. His first victory. The exhilaration flooded through him, but he didn't allow himself to revel in it for long. He carried the rat back to the den and placed it before his starving siblings. They looked up at him, eyes shining. They ate. And in that moment he knew he had done the right thing. The dark side of the wild. The forest was not only home to hunters like him. It was also home to those who hunted him. One night, as he prowled along the forest's edge searching for food, a cold shiver ran down his spine. His instincts screamed that something was wrong. He froze, listening. The leaves rustled, not from the wind. Something was watching him. He wasn't the only one hunting tonight. Then he heard it. A low growl rumbling from the darkness beyond the trees. He didn't need to see it to know what it was. A wild dog. A larger, faster, stronger predator. There was no time to think. He ran. His breath came in ragged gasps, his heart pounded against his ribs. Behind him, the heavy footsteps of the dog thundered through the forest, each step closing the distance between them. He darted through bushes, weaved between trees, desperate to lose his pursuer. But the dog was relentless. He felt its hot breath against his back. It was too close. At that moment he saw it, a large tree standing tall amidst the darkness. Without hesitation he leaped. His claws dug into the rough bark, and he scrambled up as fast as he could. Below, the dog let out a furious snarl, circling the tree, snapping its jaws. But it couldn't climb. He had won, at least this time. Yet he knew that one small mistake, one moment of weakness, and he would be dead. The forest had no mercy. The loneliness of a survivor. Time passed, and he was no longer the frail little kitten he once was. He had become a true predator, a silent shadow slipping through the trees, a pair of golden eyes glowing in the night. His prey no longer escaped so easily. His pursuers no longer caught him so easily. He had adapted. He had survived. But he was alone. His siblings had grown, strong enough to hunt for themselves, to leave the den behind. They had each gone their separate ways, following their own paths. He had no one left. Only the forest remained. The cold rains. The long, soundless nights. The wind howling through the branches, whispering like the voices of lost souls. He looked up at the sky, at the round, glowing moon. And in that moment he wondered, was there someone somewhere far away looking up at the same sky? Did anyone remember him? The survivor, the one who belonged nowhere. A lone stray cat in an endless world. The incident, losing mother. An unusual evening. That day the forest was bathed in the golden-orange hues of dusk. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting long streaks of light onto the ground, like the claws of an unseen predator reaching out to seize the world. Ethan sat at the entrance of the cave, his golden eyes glowing with vigilance. His younger siblings were curled up inside, lost in peaceful slumber. But he did not sleep. He was waiting for their mother to return. He was used to her hunting trips, how she would vanish into the depths of the forest, only to return under the silver moonlight, carrying a plump rat or a still-twitching bird. But tonight, the sun had long since disappeared behind the mountains, the shadows had thickened, and yet she had not come back. Something felt wrong. The scent of blood. A cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a scent that made his entire body stiffen. The scent of blood. But not the blood of prey. It was the blood of a cat. Ethan sprang to his feet, his small legs propelling him forward like an arrow into the night. Instinct told him where to go, guiding him through the undergrowth toward the growing stench of iron and death. Branches whipped against his face, but he didn't care. The sounds of the forest faded into nothingness. There was only one thing on his mind, finding her. And then he saw her. The fallen mother. She lay there, sprawled in a patch of trampled grass. Her once glossy gray fur was now matted with dark, sticky blood. Her breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps, her body trembling ever so slightly. Ethan ran to her, pressing his face into her fur, nudging her desperately, trying to wake her. But she only half opened her eyes, gazing at him with a fading light. A deep wound gaped across her throat. He understood what had happened. A wild dog. Or maybe a fox. Some predator had attacked her. And though she had fought with everything she had, she could not escape the grasp of death. Unspoken final words. His mother tried to lift her head, but she was too weak. He pressed himself against her, trying to hold on to what little warmth remained. She looked at him, her eyes filled with love and regret. She wanted to say something, but she no longer had the strength to speak. Yet he understood one thing. She wanted him to live. One final breath. And then she was still. The coldness of the world. Everything fell silent. The wind still blew. The leaves still rustled. But to him the world had changed entirely. He did not cry. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't. He only sat there beside her cooling body, feeling the emptiness consume him. Alone. Cold. A light rain began to fall. He did not move. Could not move. Not until the first rays of dawn peeked through the trees. But then he remembered the small bodies curled up in the cave, waiting for her to return. He remembered the look in her eyes before she died. He knew that if he fell here, if he gave up now, then everything would truly be over. Pain would not kill him. But hunger, predators, and the cruelty of nature could. He could not die. He had to live. For her. For them. For himself. And so, with leaden steps, he turned away from her still form and walked back into the shadows, back to where his siblings waited for him to return. Perspective, Black Cat Ethan. 1. The first loss. Mother never came back. At first I didn't believe it. I thought maybe she had gone farther than usual, maybe she had found a large prey and needed time to bring it back. But day after day passed and still there was no sign of her. For the first time in my life I felt the cold of the forest, not just from the wind, but from deep within myself. I started searching for her. I sniffed every trace, followed her faint scent on leaves and tree roots. But it was all in vain. Mother had vanished as if she had never existed. 2. The burden on my shoulders. My younger siblings were too small to understand what was happening. They still let out weak meows, waiting for her return. I couldn't tell them that she was never coming back. I couldn't abandon them either. Every day I had to leave the den, even though my heart was filled with worry. I didn't know if when I returned they would still be alive. I feared that a fox, an owl, or even a sudden storm might steal their fragile lives away. But I had no other choice. I had to hunt, had to find food. I remembered everything Mother had taught me. I learned how to stalk prey, how to keep my body low to the ground, how to breathe so softly that even the wind wouldn't notice me. At first I failed. I was hungry, exhausted, but I couldn't give up. My siblings were waiting for me. 3. Facing the merciless wilderness. Winter arrived sooner than I expected. The freezing wind whipped through my black fur. The ground hardened, making it difficult to dig, and food became scarce. I learned to follow the faint footprints of mice in the snow, to listen for the smallest rustling sounds in the night. I began to take greater risks. At first I only hunted in the forest. But as prey became scarcer, I was forced to venture closer to human settlements. I crept into their backyards, stole food from their foul-smelling trash cans, even fought house cats that were well-fed and protected. One time I was chased by a dog, nearly losing my life. I ran until my lungs felt like they were bursting, until my legs no longer felt like they belonged to me. But I survived. I always survived. For endless nights. When night fell, I returned to the den, where my siblings curled up together, shivering from hunger and cold. I would place the prey I had caught in front of them, watching as they pounced on it with their tiny, desperate jaws. I never ate first. Only after they were full would I take whatever scraps remained. There were nights when I simply lay there, staring at the sky. The stars shimmered above, distant and mysterious. Sometimes I felt as if I had stood under this sky before, but not as a cat. Fleeting memories brushed against my mind. Images of humans, of faces I couldn't quite recognize, of a deep sorrow I couldn't understand. I wondered, was this all there was to my life? Or was I just a fragment of something much larger? 5. The exhaustion of a warrior. The harsh days passed and my siblings grew. They were no longer the weak kittens they once were. They could now hunt on their own, protect themselves. I should have felt relieved. But my body grew weaker. One day while hunting I was attacked by a marten. It was faster, stronger, and more vicious than I had expected. We fought in the darkness, blood splattering against the white snow. I felt its fangs tear into my flesh, the searing pain spreading through my body. I won. But the price was a deep wound that cut to the bone. The injury never fully healed. It made walking difficult, made me slower. I knew my time was running out. One day I no longer had the strength to hunt. I lay beneath the sunlight, feeling its warmth seep through my now rough fur. The old memories returned, stronger than ever. I had once not been a cat. But did that matter anymore? I closed my eyes, letting my body relax. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to fight anymore. No more hunger. No more fear. Only absolute peace. And endless darkness. Perspective, younger brother, Luca. 1. Big brother, the wall between us and death. From the moment I opened my eyes to this world, he was always there. He was the strongest in our litter, the first to step out of the den, the first to growl at the lurking dangers in the darkness. He was never afraid. He was the wall between us and the cruel world outside. I had never seen him falter. Even when we were starving, even when the freezing cold made us huddle together, trembling, he remained firm. He was our pillar. Until Mother disappeared. 2. Losing Mother, the first crack. At first, I didn't understand it. I still believed she would return, carrying food and warmth as she always did. But as the long nights stretched on, as the cold wind seeped into our den without her presence, I realized she was never coming back. I cried out for her, but there was no response. I stared at the entrance of the den, waiting for her familiar silhouette to appear. But all I saw was darkness. That was the first time I felt true fear. But Big Brother did not cry. He never cried. He just stood there, his golden eyes flickering with something I couldn't understand. Then the next morning he left the den. He said he was going to find food. And from that day on he left every single day. 3. Big Brother returned, but he wasn't the same. Every time he came back there were more wounds on his body. Scratches on his face, bite marks on his legs, the scent of fresh blood lingering in the air. I asked him what had happened, but he never answered. He would just drop the prey at our feet, silently watching us eat. He never ate first, never fought for his share. Only when we were full did he finally nibble at the remains, if there were any left. But I knew he was changing. His eyes grew darker. His shoulders grew heavier. His steps lost their former grace. I wanted to say something. To tell him that we could help, that he didn't have to carry everything alone. But I was afraid. Because he was Big Brother. Because I feared that if he collapsed, then all of us would not survive. 4. Time moved forward, but the price only grew. As time passed, my siblings and I grew older. We started hunting for ourselves, learning how to survive. He no longer had to venture so far. I thought finally he could rest. But fate never allowed such things. That winter, a marten came. We had no idea how long it had been watching us, but when it attacked, everything happened too fast. It charged at us like a storm, its blood-red eyes filled with hunger. We scattered. But Big Brother didn't run. He lunged at it. They became a blur of claws and fangs, a whirlwind of death on the snow-covered ground. Growls, the sound of tearing flesh, the scent of blood filled the air. And when the battle ended, the marten fled, leaving a crimson trail behind. Big Brother was still standing. But on his leg, a deep wound was bleeding endlessly. I wanted to run to him to help him, but he only looked at me, his gaze both cold and gentle. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm fine." But I knew it was a lie. 5. His final days, he slowly disappeared. He kept fighting, kept pushing forward every single day. But his body was no longer the same. His old wounds never fully healed. Slowly he stopped going out to hunt. He just lay beneath the sun, staring at the vast sky. I realized he was tired. I didn't know what he was thinking. Didn't know what memories crossed his mind as he looked up at the heavens. But I knew he was ready to leave. One morning I woke up and saw him still lying there, silent as a shadow. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I nudged him, but he didn't move. No more breath. No more heartbeat. He was gone. Big Brother, the one who had protected us with everything he had, the one who had carried the world on his shoulders, the one who had fought until his last breath, had left us behind. 6. The sky without him, but he will never be gone. I cried for many days after that. But I knew if he were still here, he wouldn't want me to drown in sorrow. He had given us this life. And to honor him we had to keep living. In the days that followed, my siblings and I continued our journey, continued walking the path he had paved for us. Every night, I looked up at the sky, where the stars shimmered like distant memories. I believed somewhere out there he was still watching over us. Because even though he was gone, what he left behind would never disappear. Perspective, the black cat Ethan. The final days. 1. The end of the road. The sun hung motionless in the sky, its golden rays filtering through the treetops, casting a soft yet chilling light over the forest. I lay sprawled atop a moss-covered rock, soaking in the last warmth of the day, feeling it seep into my fur, now ragged and dull. I had lived the life of a true stray. From a helpless kitten clinging to my mother's warmth, I had once stood at the mouth of the den, growling against the darkness. From a grown cat bearing the heavy responsibility of survival, I had fought, hunted, and protected my siblings. I had braved hunger, endured the searing cold, and learned the merciless laws of the wild. But now, as my final days crept upon me, I understood something. Nothing lasts forever. My body was failing me. My once sharp claws had dulled, my reflexes had slowed, and my legs, which had carried me across vast forests, now ached with every movement. I didn't need anyone to tell me. I knew my time was coming to an end. 2. Fading memories. Under the shade of the old tree, I closed my eyes and let my mind drift. Faint images flickered through my thoughts, visions that felt both familiar and foreign. I saw myself standing on 2 legs, feeling the wind brush against the face of a human. I saw towering buildings, endless streets stretching into the horizon. I saw a reflection in a glass window, but it wasn't the face of a cat. Something deep inside me stirred, an echo of a past life trying to resurface, yet it was fragile, like morning mist that dissipated before I could grasp it. Had I once been something else? Or were these just the delusions of an aging stray, slipping into oblivion? I didn't know. But regardless of who I had been, regardless of what life I had lived, all I knew now was that I had lived as a cat. And I would die as a cat. 3. The last sky. That day I no longer left my stone. My body had lost the strength to move. Hunger and thirst no longer gnawed at me. Only a deep, peaceful weariness wrapped around me, as if I just needed to close my eyes for a moment, just a little longer. My siblings, now grown into strong and capable cats, stood around me, their eyes filled with silent sorrow. I wanted to tell them that I was fine, that they shouldn't worry about me. But I couldn't. I could only gaze at them one last time. The sky above was vast and endless, painted in soft blues and drifting white clouds. It was a masterpiece I had never truly taken the time to admire. Everything felt so still. A gentle breeze brushed against my fur. The sunlight embraced me with warmth. And then, I closed my eyes. Standing before fate once again. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the forest. No more sky. No more trees. No more familiar scent of earth and leaves. I stood in a boundless void, 6 luminous gates before me. I had been here before. I had once walked through one of these gates. But I no longer remembered which one. Who was I? What had I once been? Was I still Ethan, the man from a distant past, the one who had lost himself in greed and desire? Or was I merely a wandering soul, drifting through the unending cycle of fate? I looked at the gates before me. Once again, I had to choose. Was my destiny already written, or was I the one who would decide? I smiled. And then I stepped forward. Perspective, a wandering soul. 1. The moment between 2 lives. I opened my eyes. There was no more forest, no more earth beneath my feet, no more biting cold of winter. I stood in an endless void, where there was no up or down, no light nor darkness. The air around me was utterly still, no breath, no sound, no movement. I looked down, there were no claws, no black fur covering my body. I was no longer a cat. But I wasn't sure if I had a form at all. I felt weightless, as if my existence had no substance. There was no heartbeat, no breath filling my lungs, no sign of life. And yet I still existed. I was still me. 2. The 6 gates, the cycle of reincarnation. Before me stood 6 colossal gates, towering in the empty void. They weren't attached to walls, had no foundations, and simply floated in the nothingness. Each gate bore a distinct color, an aura of energy unique to itself, like pillars marking the paths of fate. I knew these gates. I had stood here before. But I could not remember which path I had taken last time. I searched my mind, desperately grasping for any memories that could tell me what I had once been before I became a cat. And before that, how many lives had I already lived? My memories were fractured. They came and went like dreams, like scattered fragments of a story I had lived but could no longer fully recall. I remembered the forest. I remembered the cold. I remembered those small eyes looking up at me, filled with trust. I remembered hunger, pain, the struggle to survive. But before that, what had I been? An image flickered in my mind, a human figure, blood-stained hands, empty eyes, a bitter smile. Someone. Was it me? A strange feeling crept into my being, a sorrow so deep yet without an origin. I wasn't sure if I wanted to remember anymore. Perhaps forgetting was its own kind of mercy. 3. The question of fate. I looked at the 6 gates. Each one represented a different path, a different choice, a different fate. I could step through any one of them and the cycle of reincarnation would continue once more. But did I truly have a choice? Or was I simply caught in an endless loop, unable to escape? I had once been human. I had once been a cat. I had lived, loved, hated, fought, and died. And now I stood here again, a nameless soul with no memory of where I belonged, forced to choose yet another life. So then, what was the meaning of all this? Was I truly moving forward, or was I simply repeating the same cycle over and over again? I recalled the strange dreams I had as a cat, visions of a past life I could not understand. That feeling was even stronger now. How many times had I walked this path? What choices had I made before? And was I truly getting closer to liberation, or was I just sinking deeper into the fog of ignorance? 4. A gentle smile. I smiled. Perhaps I didn't need to know. Perhaps the most important thing wasn't who I had been, but who I would become next. I stepped forward toward one of the gates. Was destiny already decided? Or was I the one shaping it? I wasn't sure. But I was ready to find out.